at it when you were 62 and Social Security?
Did I look at it?
Yeah.
And I said, I didn't. Actually, I'm drawing half of my ex-husband's because I want mine to keep growing.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't affect mine.
Yeah.
Draw half of
Yeah.
his. And his was a lot. Go for that. Yeah. I've been married 10 years. It doesn't affect mine. Mine keeps growing until I
Is your microphone off just to be clear?
No, it is. I
Okay.
see, that's why. I wonder when he's going to find out about that.
I don't know what Nick's recording
You'll
back
never
there.
know.
They never know.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started here with the work session for April 17th, 2018. Two items on the agenda, discussion of potential, and they're related to the budget, discussion of possible or potential small transportation improvement projects, and a review of the budget process. Where are we and what are the next steps from here? So I'll entertain a motion to adopt. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Mr. Rory.
Sure, thanks. So the purpose of, I guess, this particular part of the work session is largely to go through what you have on your handout, which is a PowerPoint presentation that's called Potential Small Transportation Improvement Projects. These are projects that are smaller in scope than some of the larger transportation projects I've talked about at length. You all have talked about at length, and so that they're smaller in scope, which would have a smaller financial impact, and also from a schedule perspective are projects that could be accomplished in a much shorter time frame than some of the larger projects that, again, we've talked about before, mainly projects like 16 Widening Project, Waxhaw Parkway, so on and so forth. We're going to, at least my plan was to take a slightly different approach, which I was going to use kind of more of a Google Maps type of format to walk us through the different intersections. We'll follow, not intersections, but projects rather. We'll follow along with the presentation with kind of two planned exceptions. One is with the first project that we'll go to. Instead of southbound left turn at Waxhaw, Marvin, and Kensington, that's actually going to be southbound left turn at Waxhaw, Marvin, and Gray Byram. So just a clarification there. And then once we get to the end of the presentation, I'll have an additional potential project for us to talk through. Feel free to stop me at any point. This is pretty free-flowing on my end. There's no priority placed on how these projects show up in your presentation. It was really just here's some opportunities. So again, if I talk about one before the other, it has no implied or explicit sort of priority attached to it, and we can certainly go in a different arrangement if you all feel that's beneficial to kind of absorb in the info. So I'll stop there before I get rolling to check in and any questions you all have kind of about the presentation so far. Very good. So just kind of start again with the one potential project that we could certainly look at taking on is a southbound left turn lane on Waxhaw Marvin Road at Gray Byram. If you recall, Landover, the developer for Millbridge, has recently completed some turn lane improvements at this intersection. They completed a northbound right turn lane on Waxhaw Marvin onto Gray Byram, and a westbound left turn lane on Gray Byram to Waxhaw Marvin, and that leaves this kind of northern approach without any sort of turn lanes. So to kind of complete that intersection, so to speak, one potential project that we could consider taking on is a southbound left turn lane. I want to make a point that will show up as a consistent theme throughout each one of these projects, or at least several of them. There is an implied question in each one of, or in several of these potential projects about allocating resources onto NCDOT maintained streets. I just want to raise that as an item so that it doesn't get lost throughout this presentation, that a lot of what you'll hear me recommending are improvements on state maintained roads, primarily because those are the highest traffic, the highest traveled roads that we have in town. So it really becomes a matter of, if we're looking to address the needs where they are, several of them happen to be on DOT maintained streets. So I will go to a street view so you all can see this intersection in a more detailed.
Is all of that within the town limits, or is any of that Marvin related? Because I know the property that on it, on the west end, is outside of the town limits.
That's correct. So there are some, to your point, I think this property to the left, mainly, so that's, I guess, officially outside of the town limits, but as it relates to kind of this recommended project, or proposed project rather, I think we're right, kind of on a town limit boundary, so to speak, where even though this piece of property is outside of the town, I think the town experiences the most, and town of Waxhaw experiences the most impact in terms of traffic, largely due to kind of this other end of Gray Byram, right, which is Highway 16, and I'll try to drive slow so we don't get dizzy. But this bookend condition is very much connected to the Waxhaw Marvin Gray Byram intersection.
Dennis, can I ask you? You stressed a moment ago that we're talking about state roads using our money instead of waiting for state money.
That's correct.
Okay, so these are projects that we could get state money for. The idea is that this would be faster.
These are projects that we would most likely have to use town money for.
No matter what.
I wouldn't say no matter what, but the big drivers for state money being used on this type of intersection is safety related.
Okay.
And so they would look for a crash history.
Okay.
And so if we want to maybe be ahead of that sort of analysis, then I think we would have to use town resources to make that sort of improvement. Got any questions on this intersection? Okay. So if we
What's the going rate for a turn lane?
going rate for a turn lane, for a left turn lane, probably $250,000.
And that's including engineering, or
That's prime. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You could
$250,000.
yeah, you could get that all with a standard left turn lane. Let's see if I can get this oriented a little bit more north-south so it's not an angle. So what's on your screen, we've gone a little farther down Waxhaw Marvin Road. This is Waxhaw Marvin if you kind of follow the little cursor. This is Pine Oak. Pine Oak is maintained by NCDOT, and it is a connection, primarily a connection, or a connector road rather, between Waxhaw Marvin and Providence Road on this end. So if you follow my cursor, this is all Pine Oak. And so one opportunity that we have, there's another one that I'll bring up a little later, but one opportunity that we do have is to look at realigning this intersection at Pine Oak and Waxhaw Marvin. Right now this is comes in at an angle that makes it difficult for people to look back right primarily to see oncoming traffic. I think we've been fortunate that in terms of folks kind of understand that dynamic, and they really are looking back very diligently and carefully. but ideally we would want an intersection that was a little bit more perpendicular to Waxhaw Marvin Road. And so
You have two issues. You really cannot see traffic coming this way. Down here, you just can't.
And so making kind of this little button hook turn that I'm showing, that starts to kind of help create a more traditional intersection condition where it's perpendicular and the sight lines are a little bit easier to negotiate. Just as you know, as we continue to grow as a community, these types of intersection fixes I think are important to get ahead of the curve, because that's, for someone, that could be an area where they may be interested in putting a house on this piece of property. So we just want to kind of be careful, not be careful, but be forward thinking in how we look at these opportunities, so that we're not in a situation where there is a house in an area that we could otherwise have made some sort of improvement that would have helped sight lines and just traffic in general.
Would that be a good place for a roundabout?
I don't think a roundabout would be necessary there. I think a simple kind of realignment of what I've shown would be a little bit better at this intersection. I think if we had maybe one more major road coming into that intersection, I'd start to kind of look at a roundabout. But I don't necessarily think one is really warranted there.
So what you're proposing to do, that piece of land right there that you're right there, you would be proposing to cut into that right there?
That's correct.
That's property of the homeowner right there? Okay.
That would be a part of the project decision.
Okay. And when you come, if you're on this side of the road, on this side of the road right here,
Okay.
the road, there's like a little incline right there coming. So is that gonna change the road here too, or you're just proposing to change the corner?
Just proposing to change the corner, so pine oak only. I think, are you talking maybe a little vertical hill, a little hill? Okay.
When you're going north.
What I was referring to
Right
earlier.
here, it comes up a little fuzzy along this side of the road here. You can't see the cars on the opposite side when you wanna make that left turn. Until you get right there, you have to look because, you know, it's up a little, so the road wouldn't change, just the corner turn area.
That's correct. I'd say if this did indeed turn into some type of a project, what we would do is we'd look at sight distance, right? Because that's the biggest, I think what you're describing is a sight distance issue. We would look at what a realigned intersection, is there available sight distance, and is there anything that we could do, even if we were to Waxhaw Marvin Road, to help. That's tough when the issue is kind of a vertical hill, because really the only way you can address that is to lower the hill, and that's pretty costly to do. And I would just recommend we have a pretty decent amount of analysis that we do to support something like that, because that could be very expensive.
Will that come up in the corridor study?
I don't think the corridor study would get that detailed. If it does, I mean, I think that's helpful, and I can certainly point that out to the consultant that's working on it. But a corridor study typically wouldn't get that detail. It would look at opportunities similar to what I'm talking about right now. There's an opportunity to realign Pine Oak to create a more traditional intersection. It would make those sort of statements.
When you mentioned that a possibility of a house could go there, do you know, is that property all that of that homeowner that's right there, or is that a different property owner? Do you know?
Is it one lot, one parcel?
Right.
Yeah,
She's asking.
You don't.
I'm not sure off of memory. I was just kind of making the point that anytime we realign over property, that's something that would have to be considered, you know, early on in that decision of whether or not it's valuable enough for us to make that sort of change, given that there are some property impacts.
Is there an accident record for that intersection?
I don't know of a significant accident history there, or a pattern rather. I can certainly get some data. I think data is is helpful. The pattern is another. So within the data, which I can certainly pull, is the pattern of any sort of issue. That those two kind of components really matter. Because if we're having an issue at any intersection, we'll just take this one off the table. Just because we're having an issue doesn't mean it's a consistent pattern, and so you typically make changes to an intersection to address patterns of behavior, not necessarily. I don't think one fix to an intersection can address a whole bunch of issues that don't have a pattern associated with them. Yes, sure.
Speak into the microphone.
I think this is an intersection that really needs
Sure.
whether it comes up by cutting through this property or by putting the road whatever.
Okay.
We're on the hook down at the bottom of the hill to connect into Prescott Glen Parkway, correct? I mean,
Yes.
on the hook, relatively
Well,
speaking, but that is something that
Well,
has been discussed as well on Pine Oak.
and that's actually on this list, I think. Right?
Okay,
So
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get ahead of you.
it's okay. I mean, I think it's let's see. And if it's not, it's certainly something that we have talked about, and it may not be on
I
here.
didn't see it, that's why, so, okay.
Yeah, I think maybe we had talked about it. We talked about it maybe internally, that a connection back to Prescott Glen was also an option. And I mean, I think that speaks to the list that we have. There's not really, again, it's an illustrative list of opportunities that are out there. There could be more, and I think, you know, we're certainly open to hear what more could be out there. But I think this list was a first attempt at saying, here are some things that are more within our control that we could do on a schedule and a budget that would be less than waiting on the larger kind of state wheels to move.
And I only mention it because down at that end, if I'm not mistaken, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 150, 200 homes that when that light goes on, there is not going to be a right turn off of Pine Oak. So they either would have to come up and go all the way around, or that connection was something that was discussed. At least that was the last bit of information that was shared with us.
Sure. So, another kind of opportunity, and this is I think at least these first three, there's kind of a consistent theme, at least with kind of all along Waxhaw Marvin Road.
So we get a left turn lane for $250,000. What is a modified Pine Oak ballpark get to? We pushing $1 million, $500,000?
I think probably more along, still 200 to 300,000 is what I would kind of back of the envelope. So another opportunity is the kind of the town-owned property that we have here on Waxhaw Marvin. I think it kind of during various kind of conversations we've talked about potentially a left turn lane at this existing entrance. Again, that's an opportunity there. I think that's fairly straightforward with what that could do. I believe this is Quellen, if I'm not mistaken, and this is at one point it was maybe Oak Grove Estates. They seem to change names, so they may have changed names, but I'm pretty sure they were required to put in a left turn lane, if I'm not mistaken. but it leaves kind of a left turn lane at this intersection. I believe this Curitan intersection has a left turn lane. It would certainly create, again, an opportunity to get left turning traffic out of the through lanes if that was an approach we wanted to take. So that opportunity is there as well.
I had a concern about that one.
Sure.
We have to, in my mind, wait for the Parks and Rec Master Plan to come back. And then when that does and we're ready to think about that, perhaps as park, I know the discussions have been trying to preserve the entrance that's there now, try to preserve the tree line, and try to have a wide enough entry road so that you could get one lane in, one lane out more easily than the existing road. So I would think it may end up on one side of it or the other. So we've got a few more moving parts on that one at this point than some of the others.
Okay.
Curiosity question. Let's forget the parcel of land, but you do the Waxhaw corridor study, and basically gets down to might as well make it a 3-lane road all the way up. I mean, turn lane, whichever, given the number of driveways there. How do we then elevate that, or what are the next steps to elevate that to the state, or does that go then on the STIP project list and stuff like that to get the improvements made? Because some of this we may not, to your point earlier, Commissioner Lee, where does it become state funded versus our funding, and is that, what's the next step after that? A lot of moving parts.
Yeah, so I think the state has a different volume threshold before they really start to consider traffic volume threshold before they start to consider projects appropriate for the larger STI funding competition pool that you'll see roads like Highway 16, Highway 75, and even Waxhaw Parkway compete for those types of roads. I think we're a number of years away before we really have volume on Waxhaw Marvin Road that would make it a competitive project. I think another thing, if I recall correctly, one of the basis for even getting into the state's funding pool is being on what's called the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or the MTP. And Waxhaw Marvin Road, as I recall, was not a candidate project for the MTP. Just didn't meet the criteria for an MTP. And so that within itself is a limiting factor with getting into that state competition pool for money. So it's a very important road to town of Waxhaw, and I'm sure to Marvin as well, as it kind of changes jurisdictional boundaries. But as it relates to the overall state system, I think they would be content for it to be 2 lanes for a number of years until it reached a volume to where it would raise to the level where it was MTP appropriate, and then get submitted for a candidate project. So one of the ways we've tried to address it, certainly on the development review side of things, is whenever there is a development plan that comes through, especially if it meets a certain kind of size, we have to be careful with the size of a development versus the infrastructure we require. But the majority that we've seen recently have met a threshold for us to require left turn lanes. And so essentially what's happening along Waxhaw Marvin Road is, as developers are building out their sites, they're building out a 3-lane section with the addition of turn lanes. And so it's incremental, no doubt, but that's kind of the nature of how, when you match the developer requirements to what they're intending to build on site, you kind of get an incremental improvement along the road. If you want to take it on more comprehensively, then I think conversations like we're having right now, where the town participates, becomes a real consideration and a real factor, so to speak. Any more questions on this particular one? And I will note that some of what we're talking about now in terms of the cross section, again, we should get some help in terms of informing us what the appropriate cross section is with the corridor study. That's kind of largely why we even went through the process of getting the corridor study performed. But the reality in real time, we are certainly making sure that as folks are trying to come in and develop sites, we're matching their site infrastructure in support of what we think a recommended cross-section would be from the corridor study as well.
When do we expect to get that full corridor study back?
August.
And as far as dates, the public kickoff to the study is likely May 1st.
Correct.
The study has been underway for a bit, but the public portion where there'd be a community meeting is likely going to be May 1st. That's the target date.
Correct. Thank you. So, not moving too far down the road, but still we're on the same road, and see if I can again get this kind of oriented in a way that's about that. So kind of Town Creek Park, again, left turn lane is kind of the recommendation at Town Creek Park, and that's really kind of at this intersection. I think if we were to go to a street view, some things look a little bit different kind of on the street view than maybe what this particular aerial is showing. But the potential project that I'm referencing is again a northbound left turn lane into Town Creek Park. I think, as we all know, kind of we'll say a short-term and maybe a little bit longer-term plan for Prescott Parkway, or Prescott Glen Parkway, is for these two to connect. And so if I were to zoom out just a little bit more, you'd see that would essentially be another east-west connection between Providence Road, Waxhaw Marvin Road. So we would anticipate, or at least I anticipate, that there could be more volume that comes through. Maybe choosing to get into the park, maybe not, maybe just continuing to go northbound and southbound. But for the individuals that do want to make this turn into the park, we could certainly have a situation where folks are having to wait, through-bound traffic is having to wait for that left turn to turn into the park, or left turns plural turning into the park. So there's an opportunity there, something that we've talked about, not recently, but NCDOT is planning to, I think it's a 2021 schedule, but planning to replace this Waxhaw Marvin Road Bridge. And so one of the earlier pieces of feedback I offered to their design build team representative was, we were interested in sidewalks, at least having the conversation about having sidewalks on the bridge, and what does that mean. And then also, could we look at a bridge design that really accommodated some of what our turn lane needs may be. So essentially a 3-lane bridge as opposed to a 2-lane bridge, and kind of what does that design look like? What does that cost look like? But we certainly wanted to have them consider these items, because we kind of knew that we weren't planning for now, we were planning for the future, and the likelihood of them changing out that bridge over the next 25 to 50 years is not very likely. So we have an opportunity to to try to really push for what we think that we want. The reason I'm spending time on the bridge is because of the proximity of this bridge to what I've recommended by way of a potential project. They're very close, and so whenever you, without getting too kind of into the technical details, whenever you introduce a turn lane, in particular a left turn lane, you also have to do widening on the other side so that as you're traveling, it's a smooth kind of ride. So that would mean a left turn lane into Town Creek Park would mean widening on this side of the road as well. And so there's not that long of a distance before you hit the bridge. And also, if you recall, Waxhaw, Marvin Road, and Kensington Drive, and some of the intersection improvements that are scheduled at that intersection as well. There's a lot that could happen between kind of Kensington Drive and this Town Creek Park intersection, and so we're trying to be thoughtful about making sure all those things sync up.
So I assume when they work on the bridge, the road's closed.
Don't know yet. I've seen some bridges, and I've seen some roads stay under traffic while a bridge gets built. It just depends if they're going to try to build it in the.
Because that's a replace. I mean, that thing is in.
Right, but you can build a bridge beside it and connect a portion of, so you can build a bridge right next to it, the new bridge, and you can connect it to the existing road and keep the road under traffic and take out the bridge. I just don't know where they're going to do that.
So I guess my question is, given that that's going to create some kind of traffic bottleneck of some kind, are we looking at working with the developer of Prescott Commercial to get them to complete their work so Prescott Glen goes all the way up and we give citizens another pathway up to 16 so they don't have to go all the way around in town or get stuck in the traffic? Or is it too early to ask that question?
I mean, I think it's maybe too early to try to answer, are we working with them for that specific purpose? I think we're independently working with the Prescott Commercial developer to get that project moving forward and compliant with all of the rules that it has attached to it. And so that's kind of irrespective of what's happening here. When you connect the two, I think that if the Prescott developer is pretty focused about bringing that project to fruition, we would anticipate that work being done before NCDOT's work even kicks off. I mean, NCDOT is talking about 2021 in terms of a construction schedule.
Only 2.5 years away.
Yeah, I think Prescott's maybe talking 2019 on this bridge. That's the latest request.
Sure.
We're going up and down Waxhaw Marvin here. Just making sure I'm understanding this correct. We're not going to get results from the corridor study till probably sometime in August, but we're considering all of these projects along that road without the results of this study to put potentially in the budget that has to be done by the end of June, when we won't have any results from the corridor study yet.
So any needs along, or potential projects along this corridor could stand alone without a corridor study. I think the corridor study itself can help articulate what the needs are over a much longer time frame or horizon, but
might that not then help us prioritize these projects?
yeah, I mean, it could. I think it kind of gets down to you all's comfort level on how you want to prioritize the project. I don't think the corridor study itself has to shape how you prioritize what you take on first, but for some folks, if they want that level of detail and information, and if that's helpful, then I mean, it's certainly another document. It's a technical document that you can look to get some of that information.
Okay.
It doesn't again, it doesn't maybe change what I think we've maybe identified already, and can pretty easily point out as some straightforward, here are things you could do today, regardless of any deeper analysis that could have a benefit to just traffic flow along that road. I think that's largely what these 3 or 4 potential projects that I've noted could do. All right, so switching gears just a bit, on a kind of moving away from the roads for a second, and kind of looking at some sidewalks or pedestrian accommodations. So I'm going to go kind of downtown and focus on West North Main Street, really between Broome Street and I guess just to the left or the west of the Nivens Price building. But several years back, I think maybe April of 2015 was the completion date on a sidewalk project for West North Main Street, and and it also had some sidewalk running along Church Street, or proposed along Church Street. I mean, I think the obvious kind of goal of that project was to increase pedestrian accommodations, but it also had another goal, and I think it was, if we look at the street view, that could help. The project really looked at kind of the relationship between the height of the existing sidewalk and the actual pavement, and doors opening, closing, and cars, and really how to access the sidewalk directly from the car. So that's still an opportunity that's out there that could be explored in terms of potential project. There's a full set of plans that have been designed for this particular project. So that's certainly an opportunity that could be explored.
Sort of like adding them into the TAP grant?
So it could be. So what we had talked about, I think, about the TAP grant was that we would, as we move forward in time and better understood kind of budget-wise where we were with the TAP grant, to see if we could take this on with the TAP grant. Right now, that doesn't appear to be the case. It looks like the TAP grant's on budget, it's on schedule, but I don't think there's going to be excess in that budget to take this on. So if it were to get taken on, I think it would need to be from a funding source independent of the TAP.
Right. The funding source would be separate, but it could go together at the same time.
From a
Since
construction,
you already have drawings on it.
from a construction perspective, yeah, we could.
And these weren't the drawings before, make sure I'm getting, that showed it going one way. These were the,
No,
okay, good. Just
no,
checking.
this is.
I remember seeing some at one point.
Yeah, this particular project was, it was all about kind of sidewalk from
Okay.
here to there, and then along Church Street here.
Ballpark.
Don't have ballpark.
Educated guess.
It's going to cost several $100,000.
Okay.
It-
That's what I was trying to get at. That's not a cheap project there, which is
No.
why it wouldn't.
No, and a part of the driver for the cost, there's some underground utilities, no doubt. The design that we have kind of involves a combination of some sidewalk adjustments, but also adjustments to the road itself. So introducing more asphalt on the road itself to basically raise the elevation of the road, to lower that kind of distance between where you get out of your car and where the top of the sidewalk is. Brick pavers are also a pretty big item for that particular design as well. Any kind of questions on that one? Stay kind of close. So just switching back over to roads for a second. This is 75 or Main Street, South Main Street. This is Broome Street. Just to get everybody kind of oriented. Another opportunity. There's an opportunity for I guess this would be a east to northbound left turn lane. So left turn lane on Highway 75 onto NC 16. There is a trade-off. The obvious trade-off is some of the on-street parking would get impacted and would have to be eliminated just to create the space for a turn lane. And so again, we would have to kind of, as much as we're focusing on this approach of the intersection, we would have to make sure that all of the lanes and the geometry line up on this side of the intersection as well. But there's an opportunity there, no doubt, to look at a left turn lane if that's something that we believe is important and we value enough to make those sort of trade-offs. I don't have any sort of opinions on trade-offs. I'm just noting them and identifying them so that everybody at least kind of is clear on what some of the obvious trade-offs are.
So one of the facts, though, is that every time we encourage people to go by somebody that's making a left-hand turn on the right, we've actually encouraged them to break the law.
Sure.
'Cause that's illegal on that road. That concerns me because we've got a natural setup there for that. Somebody.
Yeah, the question I had was, as we go forward with this in particular, I would assume that you start with traffic counts. I mean, before we decide to spend $300, $400, $500, $700,000, that we know that it's not like people complain about having to walk a block from a parking place to the restaurant, but we actually have this many cars that are held up for this much time at these times during the day. In other words, a traffic impact analysis at these intersections, so we have the numbers, the scientific data to support any projects we undertake.
Sure, yeah, true. Yeah, okay. Absolutely. Okay. And
So do we have any data after doing the TAP grant and some of the studies on the parking and all that?
yeah,
Do we have data?
we have some volume, some turn volume information.
Okay.
And I mean, I think it's
Not that we need it now, just,
yeah, I think that during the peak hour for sure there's a lot of demand on this intersection for turns. But one thing just to point out before kind of leaving this intersection, as much as, at least from my perspective, as much as decisions about kind of what to do are technical in nature, they're largely, in my opinion, kind of value judgments about how we want intersections to function. And so as designed right now, this intersection has much more of a pedestrian orientation about it and a focus. When you look at just the number of lanes, the parking, the enhanced kind of crosswalks, I think that's maybe stamped asphalt if I'm not mistaken. And so I think, again, there's a technical piece of it, but then there's also the trade-offs are usually around how to reach balance, and sometimes if an intersection is more pedestrian focused, balance may look like modifying some of those pedestrian elements to create more balance for the cars. And not that there's a right or wrong, at least from my perspective. It's just I'm pointing out that as much as we can have data to support, kind of decisions, just the thing that I think you all will wrestle with is certainly the value aspects of it, on kind of what are we trying to accomplish at that main intersection downtown. So just wanted to kind of point that out. Unfortunately, I don't think this aerial was going to show. It's going to show Gibbon Street. I mean, I guess this is. I think this is it right here. But as we again think about kind of some of our future intended uses of some of the town-owned property that we have, I think Gibbon Street can become a more important, more traveled local street, depending on how kind of some of the decisions get made around some of the land that I think that the town has interest in, or maybe even owns. And so I just put this on the list as an opportunity to think about, is 21 feet, is that appropriate? Does there need to be a little bit more street there to support maybe what some of our future needs may be? Again, but I don't think that has to be answered right now, or it's an immediate, we have to answer it, but it's something to think through. So as we're thinking through kind of land use decisions, just to be mindful of the existing transportation network that's there, may or may not be all the way set up to support, kind of some more active or more intense land uses. So just wanted to point that out as an early thought, or an early seed to plant as we're moving through some of our other decisions. So I think I'm going to move over to Howie Mine sidewalk. So in several kind of conversations, the Howie Mine sidewalk, let me see if I can get a street view going. Howie Mine sidewalk has come up as a concern, concern by several folks, and just an interest of how can we make that sidewalk condition better. If you recall, we originally approached the Howie Mine sidewalk as a potential CDBG project. There were some reasons it did not qualify for a CDBG project, but we certainly kind of started there as an option. But what could the project be? It really could be a widening of this existing sidewalk. Right now, this is a fairly narrow sidewalk that is right on top of the travel lane. Ideally, we would love if we could move that sidewalk off of the travel lane over into this kind of shoulder area a little bit more. But if, as we kind of move along the roadway a bit, I think you'll see that kind of with the proximity of some of the houses to the road, moving the sidewalk over essentially puts it in some folks' front yard. That's certainly not the goal or the intent. So one of the things that we could do to kind of help address the concerns that I raised earlier was maybe extend the width of the sidewalk so that we have just a wider sidewalk than what's there today, which would give folks a better opportunity to walk along that road farther away from traffic that's passing by them. We've looked at kind of both sides of the road. there's similar kind of challenges in terms of this right side of the road isn't, it's not an easier path, so to speak, when you start considering kind of property impacts and trees and things of that nature. So what seems like maybe a reasonable compromise, at least maybe from a technical perspective, is to look at maybe widening that sidewalk. So I'll see if I can drive up a little bit more so that we can kind of just get a feel for, when I say kind of proximity to homes. I mean, this is it's pretty close.
Comparable to the CDBG amount?
That would be,
$250,000?
that'd be what I'd anticipate, initially.
What's the distance of the sidewalk that you're talking about? Is it from Providence and then going back down Howie Mine? How far?
It's from South Providence to, I cannot remember the cross street. Let me see if I can find, is it Curitan? Thank you. Yep. Okay. Appreciate it. And just kind of one more kind of pedestrian project or sidewalk project, and then one more kind of small transportation project or roadway. A sidewalk from generally the American Legion piece of property that all the way over to Salem Street. That's about 1,300 feet of sidewalk. That's a pretty good stretch of sidewalk that could start connecting kind of development and this part of kind of the community into town. So like recently, I think there was a kind of townhome development that was approved kind of on this property. They'll have to do their own kind of frontage work or frontage improvements, but being able to kind of connect pedestrians all along Highway 75, that's a pretty good connection, at least from a walkability perspective. If you recall, the TAP grant's intended to connect the sidewalk at Broome Street to the one at the Mill on Main property. So that would be a pretty good continuous connection if that was something that we were interested in taking on. And last on
Just out of curiosity over in there, that intersection gets a lot of complaints in terms of congestion. Is that something we would push to the state? Or is that another intersection that could be number 11 or 12 or 13?
It could certainly be a 12 or 13. It would be, just looking at it on the surface, it'd be one of the more significant projects on this list, because it would involve some real work. I would say, I mean, this could be a roundabout candidate. Doesn't have to be, but you can look at signalization as well. There's a number of things that you can do right there.
I just know that's a resource drain on the police as well during the school year and the business side of it. So that's one of those complex ones that impact a lot.
So I guess 11, which is, if we were counting, I think we'd be at, excluding the one we just talked about, we'd be at number 11. And so this is not on your list, but I actually alluded to it at the last regularly scheduled Board of Commissioners meeting, and it was a possible left turn lane on Kensington Drive into Quelland. And so this is Morehouse, Kensington Drive, so there is the ability to introduce a left turn lane on Kensington into Morehouse. Right now, let me do a street view. You'll see that there's actually there's no left turn. You can see it right there, actually. Any kind of questions on this one? Or questions, comments overall?
Just some questions on funding. So a couple of the projects were on 75, so we're just assuming that these just are not ever going to come up for the state to fund them.
I think the funding source that would probably be most applicable from the state is something like a spot safety funding source, and maybe some congestion management funds. Those are very much data-driven types of funding pots of money. I just past those types of funds, or maybe even a DA kind of direct attributable source of money from the MPO. Those are the sources of funds that I think the state would participate or have a role in. But in terms of the big widening projects, I just don't see these being projects that would fall into those categories.
And then what about for those couple sidewalk projects, any chance of another TAP grant type of project, or?
Yeah, I think the TAP grant is every, I think October maybe is what the schedule has been. We could certainly submit for TAP funds. Just any of the TAP funds, or especially federal money, but state money as well, can be pretty cumbersome to use. There's a lot of reporting requirements, and oftentimes it can really impact schedule because it takes a while to get through the various approvals. So that's just something to note whenever we go after those types of funds, TAP in particular. It's pretty cumbersome and complex to administer.
Just one more question. With these projects, is there no longer a possibility of making that connection between Waxhaw Parkway and Utah? Where we've talked about it in the past for the fire department, to find a way to get from Waxhaw Parkway to Utah, to get to Waxhaw Marvin without having to go all the way downtown and get around.
I think that's always on the table, but I think this was geared towards things that could be engineered and could be done rather quickly from a congestion standpoint versus some of the bigger ones. Do I have that right? Isn't that what you have?
That's still on the CIP list.
Yeah.
But it's about a 3-point-something million plus project. But yeah, that connection's still there as a CIP type project.
And just so I'm clear, are you talking? What I heard was to Utah, which is I think maybe different than the one that would extend Waxhaw Parkway.
Correct. Okay. Yeah, there was a couple times it's been talked about a temporary connection, or not a fancy connection, or so you could get through to Utah and out Utah to Waxhaw Marvin. At some point in the future we'll extend Waxhaw Parkway, and then it becomes a moot point. But it was in the meantime, and it would have been fairly inexpensive. That's why I'm mentioning it again.
Yeah, I don't know of anything that excludes that from being a consideration.
Do you have a ballpark for the whole shebang here?
A ballpark?
My math shows about 3.1, just when I was chalking up, for this pocket. As I was adding them up, and Todd's back there going like this, so And again, that gets into timing and everything and price of goods, but and there's probably 10 more behind this, which gets to an overall game plan strategy that says we can do a small portion or whatever portion is affordable year in and year out versus, just looking at the 10 and trying to decide.
Just one more thing to ask you, Dennis. I know that you use a formula to work on town streets as far as repairs, and I know that all of our friends at NCDOT are very proud of their new formulaic or formula-driven selection process. Do we have anything like that that we could apply to these different projects without, how to rank them ourselves?
We could. I mean, we could develop that. I think that with some of the list of projects that were noted, if you recall early on, I said there's not necessarily any sort of there's not any rigidity around these projects. Right. I mean, they're pretty flexible. It was intended to show what could be done. When you start applying the criteria to it, I think that can be helpful, but if you're not careful, that can be something that it can be difficult for folks to wrestle with. If it's this project is very important to me, I don't, your criteria doesn't say so, then let's go evaluate the criteria. Right. Let's go try to figure out what's wrong with it, as opposed to just saying, hey, maybe this list of projects, the priority is really around not maybe hard kind of numerical criteria, but it's what do we value at this particular stage over the next 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, so on and so forth. Yep. That could be an approach as well.
Yeah, I mean, I know intuitively, I think that it would be much nicer to have the intersection at Broom Street and 75 taken care of, or the southbound left turn lane on Waxhaw Marvin onto Gray Byram, than, for instance, the left turn lane into Town Creek Park or the left turn lane into our 34-acre parcel. But we're not using intuition to rank things, and that's just,
yeah, I mean,
got a handle on the.
So volume, typically the way roadway projects get ranked are volume, safety, and cost. That's usually your three-pronged approach. And so I think if we were to look at just volume, which one of these streets has the most volume, or which one of these intersections has the most volume, it would shake out pretty quickly a priority based on volume. Safety is another factor, and sometimes or oftentimes safety supersedes volume. You can have volume is really about congestion, so you can have a bunch of congestion, but if you don't have a safety problem and you have an intersection that's low congestion but high crash, you tend to focus on the crashes. And so, I mean, we could come up with something like that if that's helpful. That's not a problem at all. It's just, even within a ranked set of projects, I think there'll be tough choices that'll have to be made, even within a ranked set of projects, around just kind of values on where we think we should spend resources versus other places.
No, there's no magic bullet to making these choices, I understand that, but it would be nice to know those three things that you just mentioned. They're all three very critical in making that decision.
Yeah, and sure thing. One question I would have is, this is just a list. I'm not at all trying to suggest it's the list. It's just a list. So I would say even maybe before a criteria step, is a list now the list, or is that something that needs some more dialogue? Just would be maybe I don't know if that's a question or a request from me so that I'm kind of clear on what list I'm looking at, so to speak.
That's my personal opinion.
Sure.
I think we need to come together as a board to, give you some direction. I mean, this is a lot of intersections you've gone over today, and you're right. There are probably a lot more out there.
So I guess I step back from this and I go to those CRTPO meetings, and the one thing that's consistent is it takes a while to build a road. It would be nice to know where we think we're going to be as a town 5 to 7 years from now, housing and everything, and what does our road system need to look like to support it? Because right now where I feel like we are is back the way the system used to run, which it was politically driven, and they ended up with 15% of the projects were political and 85% of the need had no funding to it. And we could all pick our favorite project here and we could really hurt the town. That's what you told us. A couple of pieces of information that really concerned me. Waxhaw Marvin isn't really on the radar screen of DOT per se. And that, which is going to be a corridor for us, we either have to address it with them, and I'm not being critical of you, I'm just getting it out there, or we're pushing everything to 16 and we're going to just keep that congestion train going. And I don't see how, I mean, we have to do these, but we also have to do it in context of where the heck are we going to be and what's that transportation plan really need to look like. That whole thing with Waxhaw Marvin concerns me because that was the strategy that was used at Newtown and Waxhaw Marvin, and that is just getting addressed because DOT can just get to that. That wasn't put through the projects that go through the CRTPO or anything, and that is painful. And we would just keep exacerbating, but we'd bring it back into town. That's what makes me nervous about this.
Can I also say, you talked about the 3 things that you thought were important data points to know.
Sure.
The volume, the safety. Is that going to be part of the corridor study for Waxhaw Marvin? Are we going to get hard data on the volume and the safety?
For Waxhaw Marvin.
For Waxhaw Marvin, yes. Okay. I will look forward to seeing that data.
Because I think back to 2015 when we got the hard data, we found out that what people thought was not true. I mean, we had a major bottleneck going Cuthbertson and Kensington, and as much traffic in that intersection at 16 as anywhere up and down the 16 corridor. We surprised people, and that's what makes me nervous. This is the growth that's coming. The growth that continues. And we haven't even talked about 75 yet.
Still happening.
We haven't even talked about 75 from South Carolina all the way up to Monroe, and that covers 3 municipalities and a county. It's not on anybody's radar screen to speak of.
So let me just jump in here. I think the conversation and the issues that y'all have all addressed on the different projects are exactly the type of conversation and deliberation that's great to get kicked off, because what I would note is that this type of framework can begin whenever it's implemented to lay the foundation for some strategic decisions that can be made by the town to identify projects. And the value of the process for these small capital projects is not really, in my experience, that you've got them ranked perfectly, that you shake out a 1, 2, 3 through 10. It's that you've come to some sort of consensus that these are projects of value that at some point in the next 5 years, 7 years, whatever the time frame you want to identify, we should try to address. Then it gets to data points such as, are there other funds that are available? So for the sidewalk projects, October is an annual time frame that rolls around. Would any project be eligible for a second or third version of a TAP grant? Would we be able to, after some point in time, revisit census information and go back and try to do CDBG as an option for any of the projects? Certainly, if there's an intersection identified and there's an increased development close by, can you partner with that developer in delivering that intersection improvement? If it's on the list, then we can make the case at the development meeting with the developer that that should be coordinated. So those type things that start to influence projects locally can be taken into account if there's a consensus that 7, 10, 5, 13 projects should be on the list. One of the things that's also good about this type of approach is that you can spend a lot of time, money, and effort trying to get to a perfect ranking system, and you are not delivering projects. This type of process, if there's some consensus on it, can start to look at essentially what are the low-hanging fruit. What's out there that can be done in 18 months? Can we get to a project that can deliver improvements to get back to what was on the retreat discussion is how do we mitigate congestion? What's on the list that does that? Like the other thing that we do know is pretty hard as far as the date is that 16 will be under construction at a point in the future, too far out, but in the future. And so what can be done on alternate corridors to allow for congestion relief if people choose to not use 16 while construction is underway? So that gets back to Waxhaw Marvin. We know that there'll be some good data come out of the study, but we also know that today existing conditions, we've got subpar intersections in a couple locations that don't really take a lot of extra analysis. We just know that they exist already. The 10 or 12 or whatever the number is there's nothing magical about it. The magic really is getting some consensus on the board as to these are projects that we want to address. And then what I would suggest and request is that you ask staff to come back with what's the reality of what we can do in the first year, what can we do in the first 2 years. That starts then informing the budget process. There is $3 million worth of need there. If you take one of these projects away, there's probably another project waiting in the wings that's $3 million in total. So the need is not going to diminish. It'll probably increase if we start looking and talking about additional projects. But this sets up a framework really to address things that are beyond the state's current capacity to deal with. And I think what Dennis said very diplomatically is STI has made a lot of strides. We're in 5.0. It's not going to change substantially without a commitment at the state level to really flood more money into the overall network and the system. And there's already $60 billion worth of projects out there lined up to be at the table before we can even get to the table. So the smaller road projects are going to be on the town if the town wishes to do them, or be on the town and other partners if we can identify other partners to try to leverage funds. And again, that goes back to if we can find partners and use other people's money for any portion of this, that's an absolute goal.
Well, that was what I was going to say about at least the two on Waxhaw Marvin with where the park is and then Gray Byram at least. I'm just wondering for future development, if anything's going to end up at that intersection, or if Marvin can partner with us, or if
Marvin won't partner.
If there's a potential partner in the future for the park, something like that. I'd like to wait and see, if something like that could come up. I'm concerned about safety probably at this point. The couple intersections, the Pine Oak, and then over off 75 near where you're saying like for the Waxhaw Elementary in the mornings, that's my priority probably is the safety of not only vehicular but pedestrian. I see the sidewalk need on 75, that curve there. There's so many people walking to the different shops and restaurants. So that would be.
Yeah, and I think each one of us could probably make a case for any one of these. I think the question back to you, Greg, not for answering now, is maybe just like you said, the state only has so much capacity. How much capacity do we have on staff realistically to handle how many projects? Because that would help. Forget which one it is, but let's every one of them averages about 250, 300,000 other than one. So how much realistically can staff take on to do that? And that at least gives us a starting point to think about, okay, we can narrow it down. Because if we don't have the staff capacity and we say, okay, go size 15 of them, that says, okay, you're going to be coming back in 2 weeks with the budget amendment to hire a consultant, and we're going to do that, and then we get into this ripple effect. What can we reasonably do? That's
Yes, for,
Well, no, I understand what you're saying, but also in addition to what can we do, when you put out the time frame, what is realistic for us to even consider doing in the next year, 18 months, and then do you have the staff to realistically do any of that within, a specific time frame, is what it's needed.
for a community of our size, doing 1 or 2 of these a year is a win. You're not going to, first of all, you're not going to have the funding to address 5, and you may not have the funding but to address 1, if 1, depending on the scope and size. But 1 or 2 of these a year is doable to get things going, but it's going to require that we not get fascinated or fixated on any one that's the magic bullet and say we've got to do that one first. It's what can we do? Is there right of way? Are there utilities? Because in some cases, I don't want to say any of these are easy, but some are easier than others. But once utilities and right of way come into play, those are huge unknowns that, just like the state projects, we have to deal with utilities, and anytime it's a phone company or a gas or cable, it slows it down. And then if there's not a uncooperative seller or a property owner that just doesn't want to entertain a change or right-of-way acquisition, then that's putting additional time in the schedule, and it may really move the project off the feasible list. So those are the type of things where the staff could come back and say, over the next 18 months, this type project or these 2 or 3 projects have the best likelihood. There may be some other considerations that play into that to say, this project, even though we've talked about it tonight, is not ripe. It might be ripe in 24 months or 36 months, but it's on the list because we know within a 5-year time frame it will absolutely be ripe, whether it's a park being developed or there's other development that goes on. The one example was sidewalks in different locations. We know there's increased development around some of those locations, so they become more ripe as we move down the road.
Well, that's something that staff within this, someone can identify for us so that to help us in making that type of decision as to what it is that we would like to possibly move forward with this project would be more feasible for us to consider.
Look to Dennis to kind of fill in his perspective on that too, but that, in my estimation, is kind of what the framework is really an opportunity to come to some consensus that these are projects that have value, and if they don't, then they need to be removed from the list so that we don't have any expectation in the public or anywhere that we're going to do it anytime soon. But if it's something that's feasible, there's a desire for it, then as long as it's on the list, it doesn't have to say that it needs to be done in the first year or the second year. It may be that this is a project that's a 5-year out project, but it's on the list because you've got 4 or 5 more in front of it that are quicker.
Yeah, no, I mean, nothing really additional to add. I mean, I think it's pretty well said.
So one additional capacity question. Everybody talks about grants and let's go after additional funding. Typically that means you got to have some shovel-ready documentation in place. What's the capacity impact on that? That's in parallel, to be prepared for the next TAP grant, the next spot safety, or are we there?
So my recommendation on most of these projects that we're talking about is that you're not going to be able to do anything other than maybe some sidewalk projects as far as looking for grants. The sidewalk projects certainly TAP, maybe CDBG if somehow people will respond to surveys or there's change in the data collection needed. It might be a feasibility. It might be feasible. But sidewalks, really with TAP or something like that's really going to be the only thing out there, other than if the state did come back and say you have a spot safety issue someplace, and that's going to be based on traffic problems, fatalities, you know,
Crashes.
crashes.
Yep.
So I'm going to flip it around then, because I want to get to clarity. We have nothing that really that we think really needs to be looked at that we could take and get ready for outside of the normal STIP process? I mean, like the intersection over by 75 or anything like that. We don't have anything that at this point in time we think warrants it, so we stay focused on the smaller ones?
So, I mean, some we already have. If you recall, we've submitted certain kind of intersection projects for
Yeah,
DA.
I'm just talking about net additional.
Yeah. So we can, for some of the larger projects that were on this list, mainly the 75 and can't remember the cross street, but down to the elementary school. I mean, an intersection that big, that probably would be more of a DA type of project, or a project that we would submit for DA funding. It still would have to meet whatever application criteria that's in place for DA funds and compete with the rest of the other projects that are being submitted. So, I mean, we have projects we could submit to those funding kind of pools, but if you recall, any of those, or DA mainly, it's there's a percentage of the project that they fund. And so there's a town match that has to come with any of those DA projects, and so depending on the overall cost of the project, that match may not be insignificant. It could be significant. So just kind of keep that.
All these are significant when everything's said and done. And I'll drop it after this. You and Matt are two resources, the only engineering resources we have. If we're going to go focus on this and that takes your time, and then all of a sudden got to drop that to go do this or drop that to go do this, the whole congestion train just elongates. I'm just, as we're going through the budgeting process, let's balance the capacity, the funding, and all that stuff to make sure we can deliver. Congestion is congestion. People are frustrated about the congestion out there. It ain't going to go away overnight, and I want to make sure if we're going to commit, we have the capacity to do it, whatever we commit to.
Right. Understand that piece. I think the earlier feedback I was really responding to was a question I think you made about aren't there any other projects, or are there any other projects we could submit for those funding sources?
Are there others that you could think of that we need to be ready for when the funding becomes available? You don't have to answer that now, but I know how much time it takes. That's all. I just want to make sure you, Matt, have the resources to do that so we can go after everything that we possibly can without sacrificing expectations we set in the community.
Yeah, and just note that any outside funding sources comes on a schedule that oftentimes we don't control. So,
believe me,
well, I mean, that was an indirect response to anything that I think you said. It was just a factor to bring up that, grant fund, DA money, CMAQ money, spot safety, I mean, those are outside sources of funds. However, those outside sources of funds come with outside control on schedule, and those schedules may not align with what we think our schedule needs are. And so that's just something that I wanted to make sure we were all clear on, that whenever we go after those sources of funds, we can certainly put together applications and compete, but if and when we do receive those funds, it comes on a schedule at times we don't control early on, in particular when we're waiting to hear back. So just wanted to make
I think everybody in the town understands that one at this point. We're congested. Anyway, enough of that. I'll take
I think it's important to remember, as good as the TAP grant is for what we had downtown, it kind of went over a lot of people's head. This is a TAP grant, but the taxpayers are paying $500,000, $500,000 to match that. So talking about on the West North Main part, if that were done, I'm thinking 500, if we got 500,000 and went through that whole process, then we match 500,000, and that's 250,000 for two of these projects that we would still pay for. It's better to go out Waxhaw Marvin and do that and not look at the sidewalks. We need the road stuff better than the sidewalks, the way I look at it.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, and I think we've got a slide, but we also have a handout that's coming around that just reflects kind of where we're at in the process this year. Just to go back, our process started back in, actually January. So we're pretty well down the path. Tonight was an opportunity to talk about some future planning and some options as far as small capital. Our next scheduled meeting is on the 5th, where the proposed budget is recommended, and that'll be followed up then with a public hearing opportunity for the public to weigh in on priorities, goals, and objectives, and have an opportunity to have influence and say. And then we're looking at a potential budget adoption for June the 12th. So that's the schedule that we've published, put out. We've got the month of May where there's opportunities there, and those are noted just depending on how many special sessions we need or work sessions we need in the month of May, just for questions, concerns, discussion, whatever. But we're probably 70% through the process this year. The really work for the board starts early this year when you went to the retreat and started talking about priorities and things that you'd like to get accomplished as far as parks and transportation and traffic mitigation. And so that's something that we've been keeping in mind as we've gone through the process of looking at putting this schedule together, but then really interacting with the department heads and the staff on priorities that'll come forward. And so we look forward to the month of May and some good discussion, good input, good feedback from the public, and then adoption in June.
So I do want to clear up one point of confusion that is out in the public, that indeed by law we're required to have a public hearing. It is a public hearing. It's not comments packaged at the end of a meeting. So we will be doing a public hearing as we have every year. I just want to make sure that for those that are listening that that's clear out there. Questions for Greg?
Greg, is this the meeting on the 8th? Is that the first time we're going to see the budget, or will we get it when the agenda comes out the Friday before?
So what happens the 8th is there's a presentation that'll be done, and so we've not set that agenda for that night yet, but most likely the way it's been handled in the past, I think what my recommendation is that we schedule that as a work session that's done as a regular meeting. We'll go through a presentation there, and that'll go you'll get a hard copy of it at that presentation.
Okay.
That will then be released to the public that night, and we perhaps will have something in the regular session that will reflect that the proposed budget has been delivered to the board.
Okay.
The format of that we need to discuss internally still, how that's handled here, and it
Okay.
varies across the state on how that's handled, but in some cases the work session is kind of the longer, more detailed presentation, and then in the regular meeting there's a reference to it and some summary of what's in the recommended budget, but not a full redo or review of what was done in the work session.
I'm just checking to make sure, if we come to the work session, that is going to be then the first time we see it, so we're not going to have questions to ask because we won't have seen anything yet.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So that's the process is that given by the law is that the board receives that at that presentation. So
That's the purpose of the 15th. We would decide whether or not we want to use the 15th for BOC workshop, questions, clarifications, et cetera. That's,
Questions and clarifications, I mean, that might be full-on negotiations based on every one of our individual priorities. We might all come back with a copy of that hard copy with red pen all over it saying, I want this, not that. What do you want? Like, I mean, that's our chance to do that. Am I correct?
yeah, I mean, that's where we get into the discussion.
Line by line. Gotcha.
Questions, comments, anything else? Okay. Given there's nothing else, and it's 6 o'clock, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.